in the spreadsheet.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is from Pradeep Chaudhary. And his first question is that there are many articles available on the internet on the importance of planting native plants, as this helps birds through various ways, specifically providing larvae to the nesting birds. But most of the observations here are the temperate regions of North America and Europe. And his question is this applicable in the Indian context? And the related question, how does plant diversity, bird diversity, and species composition of plants affect the diversity of species and abundance of birds in a region, especially in the eastern Himalaya and the Terai Duars? So, Pratik, generally there is a positive correlation between the diversity of various taxonomic groups. So, generally, when plant diversity increases, bird diversity also increases. So, the diversity of different taxonomic groups is very, very strongly correlated. Um, so plant diversity, for example, it's been shown in Africa, for example, that the diversity of fig trees determines the diversity of frugivorous birds, birds that eat those figs. And because you have multiple species of figs, all of which will have slightly different fruits, some might be large figs, some might be small figs, that allows a number of bird species to coexist. Because species get specialized, bird species, large birds will eat large figs, small birds will eat small figs. And so, diversity of plants, as that increases, generally diversity of birds will also increase in any region. The other question that Pratik has is that while talking about the effect of logging, it has a negative impact on mammal and amphibian diversity, but it's no effect, sometimes positive effects on birds. Yes, and that's because some species that are typically open country species that will not be found in forests, for example. With a little bit of logging, what happens is that some open areas are created, and these species that are found maybe in agricultural lands or less dense forests, they come and colonize the logged patches. And so you can have no change in species diversity or even actually a slight increase in bird species diversity because of logging, because some species actually benefit from logging. It's not as if you log, then all species are going to be affected in the same way. Some might even benefit from logging. In the eastern Himalayas, what happens is when logging occurs, then bamboo proliferates in the understory. And so bamboo dependent species actually benefit from logging. And there's a conflict in management. The question continues that also there is a conflict in the methods of management of grassland in Assam, where it is necessary to burn grasses to provide nutritious fresh grasses to mega herbivores, but unburnt intact grassland is necessary to conserve grassland bird species like the Bengal florican swamp francolin, Jordan's babbler, and the black-breasted parrotbill. So the question is, can the methods of bird conservation always be positive to the taxa of the habitat? Is there any conflict between the conservation of the two? And should we apply different methods for different taxonomic groups in every habitat? So yes, it's while it is true that generally species diversity of different groups is correlated. So if you have higher plant species diversity, you will have higher bird species diversity, higher butterfly species diversity, and so on. A particular conservation action, for example, burning of grasslands, might be beneficial to some groups of species like mega herbivores. Just a minute, let me check my voice settings.
I think you're muted. Or we can't hear you.
We can't hear you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Is this better?
Uh, can you speak again?
It is better than before?
Yeah, it's better than before.
Okay. Uh, yes, so it is possible that the same management action, conservation wise, might benefit one species, but it might disadvantage other species. That's entirely true. Um, And so, managing grasslands, for example, you might have to manage different parts of the grasslands differently. For example, allow burning in some places, but not allow burning in others, so that you're preserving you're conserving multiple species. There is another question from Akshay, who says if the scenario is reversed, that is, density of open cup nests are made constant, can we expect the same result? Does the height of open cup grounds is the access to both of the nests same for the predator? So this is about the apparent competition study. Um, and yes, if you were to switch the densities of the nest differently, you would expect to see the same sort of results. So the nests were placed at such a height that that is natural. So whatever the natural height of the nest was for those birds, the artificial nests were placed at that height, and the access to either the dome nest or the open cup nest is the same for the predators. How are replacement zones determined? What is this about? Can this be a little more clear? And replacement zones for?
I'll just check the forum.
So there are only two questions on this spreadsheet.
Yeah. Are students allowed to unmute and ask questions as well? Since there aren't a lot of participants on this meet, so is it okay with you if they unmute and ask questions as well towards you?
Yeah, absolutely. Please go ahead.
You can ask questions if you have.
So I am Naveen Kumar. So
Hi, Naveen.
yeah, hi. So actually, there is a situation like Colorado Island, right? They have made it as a lake so that the animals got displaced. So before doing that, what we do, like we identified the same niche in some other region, and if we move those particular birds to another region, will it work good or how is it?
Naveen, sorry, I can't hear very clearly. Could you type your question in the chat box, please?
Okay.
Or you mean the Barrow, Colorado Island example? Would that apply to other places also?
No, Colorado Island is like the thing is the species got extinct, right, due to the ecological changes by man-made construction.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very clearly, Naveen. Can you just type your question in the chat box, please? Ma'am, you have a question? You're muted. You're on mute.
Yes, yes.
Your voice is breaking.
I just wanted to point out to Nasifa that the Week 7 assignment. Usually Mousumi does not have a video transcript, and the second one has video transcript, but the same. Can you hear, sir?
Nafisa,
Can
could
you
you
hear,
please
sir?
just type the question in the
Message
chat
in
box,
the
please?
chat box.
I think it's regarding
Nafisa?
yeah, I can hear you.
Yes,
It's
yes. I think you would got
yeah,
the thing,
I
Nafisa,
understood.
that by mistake the video transcript has been done twice. If you check, you will know
Okay.
it. Just for future, I thought I'll tell
Thank
you.
you.
Okay, thank you.
Naveen, could you type your question in the chat box, please? I'm sorry, I can't hear very clearly. And Nafisa, could you please type the other question into the chat box?
Sure. There are no more questions directed towards you in the forum so far. And a lot of Mosmi's questions are from, like, you'll have to refer to the videos, her videos for those.
So I studied painted stocks and found that they're solitary foragers, but they breed in groups. So that's usually called a heronry, where the suitable trees for breeding for these species like cormorants and storks and so on, which are over water, so they're protected from predators, from land-based predators. So those are usually called heronries. But yes, they move up, they forage maybe solitarily or in small groups, but they roost and they breed in one location. Yeah, that's called a heronry. Can a species survive when it is translocated from one niche to another similar niche location? Situations arise when buildings are to be constructed in a particular niche. Yes. In fact, for a lot of species, the fact that every species has a range. So every species has range limits. Some species have very large ranges. They're found in many parts of the world. Other species have small ranges. They might be endemic or might be found in very small parts of the world. So species that have small ranges very often are very poor dispersers. So the reason why they are not able to expand their ranges is because they are unable to disperse to new locations. But if you pick up a species and you move it to another location where there is a similar niche, then that species can actually colonize that location and expand its range. And this is happening with invasive species, right? We have, for example, miners, starlings, and so on are now invasive in North America and the Hawaiian Islands, and that's because they found their niche there as well. So when they've been transported from from Europe or from Asia and then moved to other locations, they actually can colonize the new niches. And when buildings are constructed in a particular niche, then we see that pigeons that in the wild would nest on steep cliffs actually take advantage of the fact that the buildings are being created that expands the niche for them. Similarly, with peregrine falcons, the highest density of peregrine falcons in the world is in New York City, and that's because they take advantage of the tall buildings to nest as well as prey on the very high density of pigeons that are there.
Follow up on that. Uh, but if we translocate such kind of species, the competition may arise between the species which will be present in that new niche, right? But would that lead to an extinction of some
Yes,
species?
that's a possibility. Not uh, yes, that is a possibility. Um, so when you translocate, two things can happen. One is the translocated species might not be able to survive in that new location. And so not all species are as good at expanding their ranges or moving to other locations. And a lot of times when species are moved, they can outcompete other species, leading to extinction. This is most commonly we're seeing this with the invasive plants. That as invasive plants move to new locations or shifted to new locations, what they do is that they outcompete the native species, and 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 then they lead to local extinctions of native plant species. That's happening in many parts of, especially southern India, where lantana, for example, is spreading and outcompeting native species. How do birds develop some kind of wisdom which is required for their survival in the modern world? Um, Not all birds do. Some species are more adaptable than others, and those species will continue to persist even despite a lot of human activity. So those species generally tend to be generalists. And for example, we have species like the tailor bird, the Ashiprenia, the common myna, the pigeon, that can survive even in cities, right? And so those are adaptable species. They're generalists. They tend to have broad diets, but not all species will be able to survive in the modern world. Number of species have, I mean, when you build a city, for example, or you cause disturbance to a habitat, then a number of species do go locally extinct. They stop being there, and their ranges become smaller. So not all bird species are going to be able to survive in this modern world. I mean, if you just look around you in a city, then compared with what the habitat was earlier and what the habitat is today, the earlier habitat would have supported, uh, likely to have supported much many more bird species that then go locally extinct because they're not able to adapt to the modern world. We see a lot of preventive fires in grasslands and forests, resulting in loss of foraging areas. Um, Preventive fires. This is to prevent what? Uh, in fact, so it depends on what the habitat is, right? Some habitats are fire adapted, and so many grasslands, dry grasslands, are fire adapted. So they need to burn regularly at some period, so that uh, um, the biodiversity is also adapted to those repeated burns. The vegetation is adapted to those repeated burns. Whereas there are other habitats like tropical rainforests that are not fire adapted. So in those places, management would mean that fires should be prevented, whereas fires should be allowed in habitats that are fire adapted. Or to prevent accidental fires in forests, um, yes, um, I mean, the alternative, the way the is to prevent that is to make sure that there is no fire generating activities happening in the forest. Do mixed species flocks compete or go for resource partitioning, or both is involved? Both are involved. So it depends on the exact composition of the flock, because flocks can vary widely in composition. So there will be species that feed on very different things in the same flock, and so there's resource partitioning between those species. Whereas there will be other species that are very similar in what they eat, and therefore they will be competing with each other. But the point is that a species would continue to participate in a mixed species flock only if there was a net benefit from doing so, right? So if a species, for a species, the benefit is becoming lower than the cost of being in the flock, then it would leave the flock. It would not participate in the mixed species flock. So in a mixed species flock, both are happening. Resource partitioning is happening between certain pairs of species. Competition is happening between certain pairs of species. But uh, a species would remain in a mixed flock, choose to be in a mixed flock only when the net benefit is higher for that species from participating in the flock. So misting can only be done with permission from forest department. Yes, it can only be done with permission from the forest department. It cannot be done without permission from the forest department, and it cannot be done without being trained in mist netting. And so the agencies that are responsible for training are the Bombay Natural History Society, SACON, Salim Ali Center for Ornithology and Natural History, and the Wildlife Institute of India. What kind of nets can be used in case you need to do it? So these are nylon nets. These nets have different mesh sizes, and so if you're planning on mist netting small birds, then the mesh sizes will be smaller. If you're planning to mist net larger birds, the mesh sizes would have to be larger. The rings serve as identification when they're caught in the net or observing them from binoculars. So it could be two ways. You could either have, if you use a numbered aluminium ring, usually you will not be able to read the ring number through the binoculars. So you would have to recapture the bird to read the ring number. So that's what is the basis of mark recapture. On the other hand, what you could do is for these bird species, you could place color rings on the legs, and different combination of color rings would give you the different, would tell you what the identity of those individuals are. So you could actually use binoculars and you could say, okay, that's orange and black, or this is green and yellow, and or this is gray and blue. And so those combinations will tell you what the individuals are. So those you can observe through binoculars. Migratory routes would require GPS tags, um, and how the process works for migratory birds. So generally, what you do is you place a GPS tag. It's like a backpack. So it's just like wearing a bag, a very light bag on your shoulders. You place a GPS tag on the back of a bird, and that collects signal, the latitude and longitude signal, and then transmits that signal to wherever the researchers are based. Very often, for larger birds, those GPS tags are solar charged. So when you have things like vultures or geese that are flying at high elevation, high altitudes, the tags actually get charged, solar charged, and so the life of the GPS tag is much larger. The battery gets charged through solar. Unlike smaller GPS tags, which last for much shorter time because the battery cannot be charged through solar. What to do to conserve insects to support birds around human habitation? Um, well, not use pesticides. Keep remnant bits of vegetation that can support insect abundances. Because if you don't have those remnant patches of vegetation, then there will be no place for insects. And we're seeing that with cities, for example, the rise in pollution and so on, over time, the number of insects has declined quite drastically. So you hardly see any moths coming to lights nowadays in cities, whereas earlier, maybe 20 years ago, there would be some moths that would be coming to lights, even within cities. Nafisa, are there any questions on the discussion forum?
No, most of them are for Mousumi's lectures regarding like formula and all that.
Oh, I see. Okay.
There's, yeah, there's one question though. I'll just type it out.
Sure. Is it a really bad practice to feed the birds at homes? Um, well, uh, depends. Feeding birds obviously increases their population sizes. It depends on what species we're talking about here. Some species can actually have health impacts on human beings, and so they can spread diseases. And so, if you have high densities of pigeons, for example, pigeons can spread diseases from themselves to human beings. But in general, I mean, this is more of an ethical question than a biology question. It depends, I guess, on whether you think it's okay to feed birds or not. But the consequence will be that feeding birds will increase their population sizes, and then if population sizes of some species become very very large, it can have other impacts like transmitting disease. Does carrying capacity mean the number of individuals that the habitat can support, such that all individuals have access to resources that fulfill their needs, like survival and reproduction, or individuals have access to resources just for their subsistence? Um, the so carrying capacity means that So for it means that it's the maximum number of individuals that can be supported in the habitat, right? Now, if you reach carrying capacity and individuals are not breeding, at least some individuals are not reproducing in the population. Let's say you have zero reproduction in the population, then the numbers of the population will go below carrying capacity. When that happens, to reach carrying capacity again, you have to have reproduction, right? You have to have some individuals surviving and reproducing and replacing the losses that result from deaths. And so carrying capacity does not mean that all individuals have the ability to survive and reproduce, but at least some individuals in that population have the ability to survive and reproduce such that losses from deaths are being replaced. Um, and the related question, carrying capacity, is it related to one species or the region or community in this region? So carrying capacity can vary from habitat to habitat. So for the same species, carrying capacity can be different in one region, it can be different in another region. It's not species specific, it would be population specific what the carrying capacity is. So you could have a species that has a carrying capacity of 10 individuals per square kilometer in one habitat, but it might in another habitat it could be 20 individuals per square kilometer. So it's population specific rather than species specific. Gray hornbill and how they're able to counteract toxins from certain fruits. There is literature that they consume some kind of leaves to counteract the toxin. How do I look for such leaves which they're eating solely based on observing them? Uh, I would be the wrong person to ask this question. I think if you're trying to figure out which leaves are those that have the compounds that counteract toxins, that would either have to come from observing and then checking whether there's anything in the literature that says that these leaves of these particular tree species or plant species are actually have compounds that counteract fruit toxins, or you would have to actually take the leaf and do a chemical analysis to see if it contains toxins. So observation would be sufficient if you have already evidence to show that those species actually have some kind of compounds that are countering toxins. Recently, I saw a banded bay cuckoo in my area at Gopalpur, Odisha. eBird site says it is rare in the area, but on further checking on other sites, this bird is endemic to the region. Uh, so a single sighting might not necessarily mean that the species is common. Endemic birds to regions also could be rare. So you could have endemic birds that are at low densities that are rare. So a single sighting does not necessarily mean that it is occurs at high densities. So endemicity, which is where you have a species restricted to a certain geographic range. Now that endemicity could mean, it does not necessarily mean that the bird is rare in the region where it is found. Could be at high densities in its range, or it could be at low densities in its range. Uh, does bird feeding decrease the capacity of forage hunting in the long run? So birds, generally foraging behavior in birds is quite hardwired in the brain, and you could imagine that if you fed that's if there was a very intelligent species that depended on learning from its parents, for example, on how to forage, then feeding birds might lead to the loss of that behavior in subsequent generations. But for most bird species, foraging is a very hardwired behavior, and perhaps feeding will not result in the loss of that behavior outright. Whereas behaviors that are transmitted culturally, where you have to learn from the previous generations, such foraging behaviors might disappear. Certain level of logging may keep. Oh, oh, Pratik, we had answered this question first, but we'll just touch on it again. So logging can affect different taxonomic groups differently, right? Generally, what happens with logging is that it opens up some amount of the forest, and so species that are open forest species, or species that are found in agriculture, can then come and colonize those newly created logged habitats. And so where you can have species disappearing from those areas, which are species that are very dependent on dense forests, but you can have other species replacing them. And so species richness or species diversity does not change with a certain amount of logging. Yes, there is the problem of the fact that uh, uh, what conservation action that benefits one particular taxonomic group is not necessarily the conservation action that will benefit another taxonomic group. So if you burn the forest, burn the grassland, and you burn it so that you have more nutritious grass for mega herbivores, does not necessarily mean that it's going to benefit birds also. And so the management of these uh, grasslands, is the way to do it is probably to ensure that certain parts of the grasslands are left unburned, so that species like black-breasted parrotbill can continue to live there, whereas certain parts of the grassland might need to be burned so that mega herbivores have a higher quality diet. So there can be conflicts in conservation where a certain kind of conservation action can benefit one particular group of species, but actually has a negative impact on other kinds of species. So the management has to be done by prioritizing which particular group of species is more vulnerable or more at risk. So the priorities in conservation management, there is no one good conservation measure. The the methods you choose for conservation depend on which species are priority species for conservation. Actually, that's right. Banded bay cuckoo is not endemic. It breeds in the eastern Himalayas, and it migrates down to Southeast Asia. So it is actually a migratory species. How replacement zones are determined. So referring to part of the lecture, we discussed how competition does structure bird communities, and they gave them to example of, oh right, the wrens in replacement zones in elevation. Okay, yeah, Good. I should have got that. What happens usually in these displacement zones is that you have two cannot coexist because their resource requirements are very, very similar. And so what happens is they will be found at different elevations. Now, the species that does well at lower elevations will prevent the species from higher elevations in colonizing lower elevations. And the species that does better at higher elevations, maybe it's adapted better to the cold, will prevent the warm adapted species from coming in from below and colonizing that high elevation. So the replacement zone, excuse me, the replacement zone will be that elevation below which one species does better and above which the other species does better. So that's what determines the replacement zone. And above that zone, the top species prevents range expansion of the bottom species. Below the zone, the bottom species prevents range expansion of the top species to lower elevations.
Are there any other questions that any of you would like to ask?
Okay, if there are no other questions, then we end the session, Afisa.
Sure. Thank you so much for joining in. Oh, there's
Thank
someone.
you everyone for joining in.
There's one final one, if that's
Oh,
okay.
there is one more question. Yeah, sure. White cap red starts at very high elevation in Sikkim and also in areas of low elevation like Gangtok. Yes, we so the white cap red start is a very it's a species that is very closely tied to water, and so it's a species that as long as there is water available and there is a stream, the white cap red start can go from very low elevations to very high elevations. It's a water dependent species. Plastic usage impacts on birds versus other animals. I think we'll deal with that in the conservation um, when we have questions related to conservation. But generally, what's happening, we still don't fully understand what these impacts are. But we get into it in detail. But basically, microplastics are being found in these are really small beads of plastic are being found in pretty much every organism's blood and every organism's tissues, various tissues. Um, we don't really fully know how those microplastics cause damage to organisms. But we'll look at the plastic issue when we talk about conservation in more detail.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining.
Thank you to everyone else for joining in as well.
Thanks, Nafisa.
Thank you.
तो बात कर रहे थे मैडम सोलंकी सर। हाँ चलो सर अंदर नमो। अच्छा ये रुके सर। आंटी को बोला था। सेमंटी का मतलब सेमंटी का मतलब क्या होता? क्या मतलब होता है सेमंटी? मतलब क्या होता है सेमंटी का? मतलब तो बता क्या होता है सेमंटी। क्या वही लीजिए। बारात निकल रही वहां तो पंचमुखी से बारात निकल रही युवा भाई में लगी इनकी चलो इससे पहले नहीं आना हाँ बहुत सारी आ रही है अयो लूसी लूसी के पास चलना अपने को बताया सर के पास एक लूसी है सर ने बिल्ली पाली कछुआ कछुआ तो आज तक वापस आया नहीं कछुआ मैं बोलती आज मैंने 12 पेज होमवर्क करा टीचर ने 10 पेज नहीं दिया मैं कब कल से मत करके ले जाऊँ माँ मोहिनी सिंह तो आज भी करी थी क्या मैंने बोली नहीं मैं कि चल रहा हूँ कि नहीं अरे आज नहीं जाती